Good afternoon and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think tank here in Philadelphia. Those of you in person know that, but we have a Zoom audience online as well. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thank you, those of you who are supporters and donors and board members. Special thanks to you for supporting us. We can't do what we do without your support. If you're not in one of those categories, I encourage you to join those categories. Before we get started this morning, I just wanted to do a couple event notices. One is we have our annual gala coming up. It's a luncheon this year featuring our Benjamin Franklin Award winner, Phoebe Novakovic, who is the chairman and CEO of General Dynamics. And she's going to be interviewed and discussing national security and technology with General H.R. McMaster, who's a member of our board of advisors. This is on December 13th. Yes, December 13th. We also have a seminar coming up that I also want to mention. And for those of you who are in person, we have little handouts about it, and it's also on our website. This is featuring Robert D. Kaplan, our Robert Strauss Suppé Chair in Geopolitics, who's going to be speaking on great thinkers in realism and geopolitics. And the dates of that, it kicks off the evening of Thursday, January 11th. It's Friday, January 12th from 10 a.m. to 2 in the FPRI office here in Philadelphia. So look for that on our website. It, I'm sure, will be a fascinating day and evening. So let's go ahead and get started today. We have our guests here today, Gaye Christoffersen, who has taught at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS Nanjing Center, the Naval Postgraduate School, the University of Hawaii, and Eastern Mediterranean University. And she is going to be joined by Gilbert Rozman, who's a senior fellow with our Asia program at FPRI. He's also editor-in-chief of the Asia Forum, a bi-monthly online journal on international relations in the Asia Pacific. He's also the Emeritus Musgrave Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. And they are going to be talking about their new book, Putin's Turn to the East. And to discuss it, they're here with the chair of our Asia program, Jacques deLisle, and the program director, Mike Beckley. We're going to have, those two are going to discuss with them for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to turn to Q&A from the audience. So be thinking of your questions. Those of you in the virtual audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael Beckley.
Great. Thanks, Raleigh. Thanks to everyone that's come here and everyone in cyberspace, and especially to Gaye and to Gil for bringing this wonderful insight to our discussion. This book really couldn't be more timely. Putin's Turn to the East, given that I think Vladimir Putin is still in Beijing. He's hanging out there right now, no doubt talking to his best friend Xi Jinping, extolling their bromance and taking pot shots at the United States and calling for a multipolar world. And I have to say, just in my own experience, journalists are peppering FPRI scholars wanting to know how should we be characterizing this relationship between Russia and China. Is it a marriage of convenience that's just built around a few narrow interests and it's going to fall apart? Or is it this sort of no limits partnership, this Eurasian duopoly aimed at reordering the world? Or could it just be that we're witnessing the reemergence of a more Chinese-centric Eurasia, given that Russia seems to be falling apart in many ways, and that Russia could become, as some people called it, a pimple on China's nose going forward? And I think we are so lucky to have these scholars and this book to discuss all these issues today, because I really do think this is the best book written on this subject, at least one that's come out recently. And what they do, and I'll let them explain it more, is they show how the partnership that we're reading about in the headlines today has been more than a decade in the making, and that it's also the nature of that partnership has shifted a lot over that decade with changes in Russia's power and in their interests, And there's been major turning points along the way. So I'll turn it over to Gaye and Gil to kick us off, and then we'll have some commentary from Jacques, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion with everyone that's here. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be back at FPRI, and where I've had many good associations. And I'm delighted to have a chance to talk about a book that Gaye and I organized together, and we had a few contributors, but mainly we have written it. And we've tried to understand the last 10 years, what has gone on in Asia. It's actually the first of 4 books. There's a South Korea book that just came out. There's a Japan book covers a decade, and the China book is on the way. We're going to finish that next summer. And so I'm working with other people on those, and we're trying to get an overall view of the last decade and the transformation of the Indo-Pacific region. And really 2012 and 2013, that's when things got going in a new way. Xi Jinping took over, Putin came back to office with a strong message, and we wanted to understand what's going on from the Russian point of view. And it builds on articles that I summarize every 2 months. So I've been writing something called Country Report Russia since 2013, which takes 25 or so Russian articles and interprets what they're saying about Asia. And so we've got over 1,000 articles, and then other contributors used other languages. So we've covered from the Chinese point of view and beyond, but really it's Russia-centric. And we're trying to understand how this relationship between China and Russia and how Russia's overall approach has evolved. This is not Obama's pivot to Asia. This is something quite more dramatic. This is an effort to turn Russia, a country perennially part of Europe, into a Eurasian and even an Asian country by joining with China and figuring out a plan for multipolarity in Asia, trying to find a design for how this could work out. And so the plans for what would happen shifted over the decade. And it's really interesting, the Russian publications cover this not only with glorification of Sino-Russian relations, which is the mainstream, but there's a sort of a deviant point of view all the way through this decade that keeps bringing us to problems. Something's not going right. They can't talk about China-Russia relations as bad. They can't criticize Putin. They can't criticize China. But boy, do they tell us a lot of interesting stuff about what's going on. And we turn out, if we go for each of these 4 stages, and we look at the views from 7 directions, looking from Moscow, we get different ideas about what has been going on in this decade. And I think actually it's so important what Putin tried to do in Asia that I think actually this is a fundamental reason why he went into Ukraine, because he was trying to prove to the Chinese that he's part of the grand strategic triangle with the United States, and he was losing ground. He was becoming more a junior partner to China. And if he took Ukraine, that would change the whole dynamic. And he would be able to say, I really represent Eurasia, the European Economic Union. We've now built it up. We've challenged the West. And now we can really prove that we belong as a co-organizer of Asia. So this was Putin's desire. In stage 1, he sought to have a broad multipolar approach before the Crimean War. And then he was talking about better relations with Japan, with South Korea, emphasis on the Russian Far East, modernization, whole series of things. Stage 2, after the Crimean War, he leans much more to China, but he's still carrying out some of these multipolar objectives. And he is now thinking more about finding a common economic program with China to organize Central Asia, but with Russia dominant. And it's called docking. China and Russia dock their economies through transportation and energy and other means. But it's not working very well. China's BRI is dominating. Putin doesn't really know what to do next. And he comes up with the idea of the greater Eurasian partnership. Now he's thinking much more, but he needs India. That's critical. The old notion from the 1990s that it would be a triangle, the Troika, Russia, India, China. And so that was his hope, but China botches it. China goes into India and destroys the relationship with India, drives India to the United States, and Putin is at even more of a loss. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the two are having great trouble figuring out how to combine their energy. And so Vietnam proves to be another thorn in the side of this relationship. But they're going full force to create a stronger quasi-alliance against the United States. So they're moving in these two different directions, a complex situation, cat and mouse game, who's going to do what in Asia? One does X, the other does Y. Meanwhile, they're both saying we're joining together versus the US. It gets much stronger by the end of the 2010s. And then the Ukraine war comes and we get the final stage in this. Putin fails in his gambit. And now he's faced with the problem that he's so much more dependent on China. China moves in much more vigorously into Central Asia. And we have a situation where China can take advantage of Russia. There are many themes to this book. We cover history issues, territorial issues, economic issues, identity issues, geopolitics, and so on, with much detail about bilateral relations, drawing on empirical sources. It's really not a top-down book, but building up the arguments from below. And I'll stop there. We have this, so Gaye can give much more detail about the two fundamental areas where they struggle the hardest, and that is Northeast Asia and Central Asia. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Gil. And thank you to the Foreign Policy Research Institute for inviting me. So my three chapters are much more empirical case studies as I look at China and Russia in third countries or areas outside of China or Russia. I think the most obvious case study is the CSTO that Putin created as sort of a security organization that he wanted China to join. And China has managed to slip out of it for a long time. But in 2021, some Chinese were thinking about, well, maybe China should join this organization. But other Chinese were very skeptical about that. No, it's not. But they were thinking, well, maybe they could cooperate in Afghanistan under the framework of CSTO, which includes some of the former Soviet states and Russia. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, this was the clearest sign that China's not going to join CSTO. And all the other members of CSTO are not going to be part of the Ukraine war either. So Putin tries each country in the CSTO, and Kazakhstan is the most outspoken. The other countries just sort of don't respond, or they evaporate, or they don't confront him. But Kazakhstan is the most outspoken and saying they're not going to help. They're not going to invade Ukraine under the framework of CSTO. And so that is the clearest sign of Russia and China not cooperating, and Putin losing influence and authority. The other chapters, the one on Central Asia, this is more subtle. This is just small things that happen, but I think they're cumulative over time, but they happen very publicly in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also in an organization called SICA, which has been around for 30 years, and it was started by Kazakhstan, but no one has given it very much attention up until recently. In each of these, it's very clear that Russia is losing ground to China. So the formula that they've been in Central Asia has been division of labor. So China is taking care of economic cooperation. Russia is in charge of security. But it becomes very clear in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that many Central Asian countries are very unhappy with Putin because they're not, Russia's not taking care of security. There's always a lot of conflicts, and usually Russia is there to mediate or to suppress. And he's not doing that because he's very busy in Ukraine. At the same time, China introduces its own security concept. So it kind of, it doesn't say it's displacing Russia, but it indicates that this is the way we should organize security from now on. In the SICA conference that also happened in 2022, it's really Kazakhstan and the President Tokayev that is the main actor. He reorganizes how Central Asia will interact with Russia. Instead of doing one-on-one meetings between Putin and the leaders of Central Asia, Tokayev creates this 5+1. So all the Central Asian countries meet together with Putin so that they'll have more of a collective identity and more collective clout. And Kazakhstan likes it that way because Kazakhstan wants to promote a multi-vector foreign policy, a middle power strategy. Other countries don't like that. Tajikistan doesn't like that. It wants to go back to the old ways, one-on-one, maybe get more patronage from Putin. But it's clear that many of the Central Asian countries are very unhappy with Putin also because it's not carrying out its security role. The other chapter I look at is an area that I've looked at for a really long time, the relationship between China's Northeast and the Russian Far East, and the Chinese efforts to integrate economically, at least at first, perhaps politically later, but economically. And there's been many, many different projects to do that. And most recently, it's been under the Belt and Road Initiative. So this used to be kind of a local project. And most of these programs failed because there was a lot of resistance in the Russian Far East to the plans in Moscow. This local program got incorporated into a much larger Belt and Road Initiative. And it's still not doing too well. The Chinese use this as an opportunity to talk about not only integrating China's Northeast into the Russian Far East, but also tacking on the Arctic. So Russia had been very, very resistant to that idea. But the Chinese idea is that they would be equal partners in the governance of the Arctic. And China started calling itself a near Arctic state. And the Russian response in the beginning was very negative. That China has to protect its, Russia has to protect its sovereignty. And if China sends ships through the Northern Sea route, they have to pay a fee. They have to hire a Russian ship to take them, and they have to pay a fee. So that was kind of symbolic. It wasn't so much the money, but it was the idea that Russia had to escort a Chinese ship through. But China was calling itself a near Arctic state at that time and created this white paper about how China, so they're trying to restructure their identity as to what they were. I do believe at the most recent Belt and Road Forum, Putin has been more positive about China in the Arctic than he was before. I was at the Belt and Road Forum in 2017 on the track 2 grouping that was. There was a track 1 and there's a track 2, but the track 2 had a lot of government officials in it also, so there's kind of a flow back and forth. And 2017 is when Putin became more favorable to the Belt and Road Initiative than he had been before. So slowly, slowly, Putin is becoming more accommodating to China's plans for the Russian Far East. But that doesn't go well in the Russian Far East. So you see a lot of scholars being critical. Moscow's intellectuals have written 6 volumes called Towards the Great Ocean, which is supposed to explain every detail about Putin's turn to the east. So they've written a lot about it. But scholars in Vladivostok would say, well, this is just dreams of Moscow intellectuals and there's no reality and it doesn't further our economic development at all. So I haven't given you all the details, but this is the overall, that in each of these case studies, you can see Russia's influence and sphere of influence sort of eroding and giving way to China, but on a very empirical level. So and sometimes it's very obvious and sometimes it's just a very slow erosion. So anyway, I got the sign.
Yes, I'm up. So this is a terrific book. I recommend it to everybody. It addresses about as important a topic as there is out there right now. It explains a lot of what Russia's been up to, not only in its turn to the east, but it ties what Russia's been up to in Ukraine very much into Putin's turn to the east. And of course, it does a lot to explain China's behavior as well. So it's a big topic. The method is vintage Gil and Gaia. That is a very deep dive into original language sources across the spectrum of views within the two states, primarily Russia in this case, but also China they're looking at. And it uses those kinds of views, some of them critical or as critical as one can be within the censorship permitted in these systems, to get us leverage into several things. Of course, it's by no means blind to official statements and open behavior, but it uses these other sources to get critical insights into official positions, some of what goes on behind the formulation of that. Indications of the doubts within the system, the kind of things that may eventually percolate into policy changes, and a sense of the range of thinking that at least gives the possible pathways forward. And the book also puts China very much at the center of Russia's behavior. And I think that's something that was not very much in the discourse prior to the 2022 Declaration of Limitless Friendship and so on. And they make a compelling case that the roots of this go at least 10 years earlier than that. And there's an interesting sort of synergy from the beginning of China's BRI and Russia's Putin's turn to the east. Perhaps most provocatively, the book goes pretty far down the path of suggestion that Putin's war in Ukraine is to a significant degree a product, or at least partly a product, of the deteriorating balance in the China-Russia relationship, with China in the driver's seat. It paints, as you heard, a strikingly bleak picture of Russia's options. Partly that is tracing what happens from the 2013 origin story here to where we are now. And it leans very heavily into the idea that a lot of this is Putin's errors of perception, errors of tactical choice, some acts of desperation as things got worse, but it's also attuned to the structural factors, demography, economy, and other such things. But it basically says everything on Putin's wish list has pretty much come a cropper. It also makes, I think, a potent argument that you can't understand this simply in realpolitik, realist terms. This is great power politics, but there's a lot here that is bound up with perception and misperception about how China would behave, about what was possible, and about the lenses with which leaders tend to see things in ways that lead to problematic choices, particularly Putin's notion of Russian civilization, the recovery of Russia's position, and so on, and it's his misestimation of China. And I think this is quite right. As I read this book, I was reminded of an old article by Ben Schwartz from, I think, the 1950s, where he made a compelling case about why Russia and China, or the Soviet Union and China, would always be friends, and turned around and made a compelling case about why they'd always be enemies. And they were both utterly convincing, and it suggests the boundaries for choice. It matters who's in these leadership positions. Not only Putin and Xi, who are very different from other leaders in both of those systems, but it matters whether it was Abe or his successors, whether it's Kim or his predecessors, whether it's Modi or a different Indian leader, Nazarbayev, or somebody else in Kazakhstan, and the succession of one-term Korean leaders who seem to swing back and forth. Like-minded states are very much part of this story. We in the US are used to talking about that way on our side. Well, like-mindedness and ideology matters on the other side too, as perhaps more than in the US does history. And it's a book that's also very rich in the complexity of this. The dynamics are very different depending on which parts of Asia you're talking about. Central Asia, Southeast Asia, India, Northeast Asia, and so on. It's a very rich story, and of course it evolves over time. So that's sort of my quick response. In the couple minutes I got left, I want to raise a few themes or questions, as it were. One is, given the rather limited political and sometimes literal life expectancy of critics of Putin, how much room is there for these kind of critical views actually shaping policy? How do we evaluate what kinds of signals are out there are ones that we should take seriously about possible trajectories in policy and in the bilateral relationship? I take the point that there is a limited alignment between Russia and China in many ways, but how much will negative partisanship toward the US do the trick of keeping this together, despite Putin's growing concerns and China's growing contempt? Does it matter, what we see in the conventional wisdom, that Russia is a much deeper challenger to the status quo internationally than China does? That is, China seems to still get some things out of the system, maybe want to revise it, but not radically to overthrow it. There's a lot in the book about how Russia got China wrong. Has China gotten Russia wrong in a way that matters? And what do we do if Mike and Halbrands and others are right that China is actually not on a sustained rise, but maybe headed for a bit of a comeuppance, and certainly in terms of the relationships of the countries you focus on here, that the blowback against the BRI may be putting China in a somewhat weaker position. And then finally, I'd ask you, what do you make of things that have happened since the book went to press? You're shooting at a moving target. Since then, we have the bromance stage 5 or whatever it is of Putin now visiting his good friend Xi. We see the eruption in Gaza, where Russia and China are staking out a rather common position on why don't we just have a ceasefire and all get along. And we're seeing essentially the oncoming of the US election, which could lead to yet another phase, depending on who wins and what we do.
Okay, we are responding, so I guess it's my opportunity to answer those very interesting questions. Thank you, Jacques. Question number 1, what happens to the critics? Well, my favorite critic is now in Berlin, running the Carnegie Center of Berlin. His articles in Russian over the previous years were wonderful, Gabuyev, and so we see what happens. But actually, there's a parallel here. In the 1980s, I was going back and forth with China and the Soviet Union, examining their views of each other. And there were critics then. And I argued that the most interesting debates going on in the Soviet Union were debates about China. I started actually with a 6-month stay in the Soviet Union in 1972, where I began to gather Russian materials on China. And so they made a difference. They got help get a new view towards China through against very difficult opposition. I think right now we have to say they are being pushed aside, but it's amazing what they've been able to write in the last year. If you go to my articles on the country report in Russia, every 2 months, including September, there's some really interesting things being said by people I would call breaking from the mold of the majority. So there's something going on in Russia. This doesn't happen by chance. There's some kind of debate about Asia going on, even if they can't debate Ukraine and the United States right now. On the second point, yes, negativity of towards the United States is dominant. This is what drives them closer together, and it's driving them even more so, as we see China has reason just in recent months to be more critical of the United States, and that gives them more support for Russia. But at the same time, China is interested in sinocentrism, and Russia's a target of that sinocentrism. And China is not going to be very easily restrained. Their arrogance towards Russia was visible a few years ago. It's coming back. It causes problems, but right now, there's no group in Russia that could challenge what the direction they're going in. Russia's more against the status quo, more hostile to the US, therefore it needs China and can't raise these issues openly. Has China got Russia wrong? You may have to wait for the book coming out next summer, where we're going to go into great detail on that. So far, China has got Russia pretty much right, because they have been able to predict that Russia was going to go further and further in their direction. They're going to get more and more from Russia. So I think it's actually turned that way. Finally, the story, of course, did not end at the end of 2022 when this book was finished. We've got some really interesting things happening this year. We're going to get information from the BRI meeting this week, and look forward to the epilogues coming in future work, because I think that this is a non-tenable situation for Russia at some point, but right now they can't face it.
It's always my job as a commentator to get in a plug for the next book. So.
Okay.
Well, I do think I have to agree that this anti-US stance they have is really the glue that holds them together. But what it's leading to is the dream of an alternative world order. And so every empirical event that happens, they sort of weave it into the carpet of this alternative world order, which I'm sure what's going on in the Middle East or what's happening in Ukraine, the fact that so many countries did not observe the sanctions on Russia, they call that the world majority. And that's the basis for the alternative world order that they think is emerging. But I don't think, even though China talks about an alternative world order, it's very much part of the current world order. But I think China's tactic is shaping from within, to get within the world order and then shape it and change it to suit itself. And Russia, I haven't seen it be very successful at doing that. What were some of the other things? It's not realpolitik. You're right. It's not realpolitik. Because in 2013, Xi Jinping changed the priority of China's foreign policy, that there would be a shift from major power relations being the primary focus that Deng Xiaoping had announced in 1979. In 2013, Xi Jinping changed it to the periphery, and the periphery would be the focus. And Yan Shuitong explained this further, that China had to be very careful of the countries on its periphery because powers would try to cause trouble in any problem that existed in the periphery. So he changed the order of the importance of foreign policy to focus on the periphery. And this was the same year that he introduced the BRI, which very much is about the periphery. At least began with the periphery, creating what I would think is a natural economic territory between the Chinese province and the surrounding country, the border country. I personally think this is a long-term strategy, though, that I think it was the 1980s when the Chinese first started thinking about what would be called the BRI decades later. And at that time, they called it natural economic territories that extended across the border. So there really is the border. I think they have a hard time fitting Russia into this, and it makes Russians very angry if you suggest that Russia is on China's periphery and therefore it needs to be managed as a peripheral country, or it's part of the Sino-centric order, which is part of that ideology of the BRI. And anyway, I'm seeing a sign that says wrap it up, so I guess I will.
Well, I'm going to give you a chance to elaborate a little bit more, because I want to know more about what you all think Russia and China stand for. I get the negative association, just if you just read what Putin and Xi say, I mean, it just riles them that they live in a Western dominated world where, they have to do business in dollars, and they look at their technology and there's all these Western components in it. And when they go to an international conference, everyone is speaking English and they have to bring an interpreter. I mean, just all of these things that reinforce this idea that they are not the ones ultimately in charge. But what exactly are they trying to create, or are they trying to restore something? I mean, the sense I get is that they view themselves as the inheritors of these ancient autocratic land-based empires that used to have a free hand to sort of dominate their spheres of influence. And these upstart maritime powers with the British and then the Americans come along and try to have this more open global trade order and prop up little bits of what used to be part of these land-based empires, and they don't like that, and they want to go back to something that they feel used to exist. But is that it, or is this just purely a spiteful alliance that's motivated by the ideology of discontent? It really is just about breaking apart the current world order. I know you mentioned sinocentrism. These leaders talk about, the global South or a multipolar world, but what's the substance behind it? What would the world actually look like if they were able to succeed?
Well, that is the big question, and I love that you ask it. In 2015, I came out with a book on the Sino-Russian challenge to the world order, East versus West, in the 2010s, in which this is the third in a series of national identity books which I wrote. And this one dealt with the sense that Chinese and Russian national identity, sinocentrism, a huge part of Chinese identity, although I have 5 or 6 dimensions of identity that I cover, drives them to see the world in a particular way And it's really reinforcing the communist legacy in both countries. In China's case, it's also their view of the Confucian legacy, the tribute system, and so on. But the idea is that there's a natural Chinese order. And so when I've been looking at Chinese writings, for instance, even from the beginning of the Xi Jinping period, before it got more elaborate, we see this sense that Korea is part of China's sphere. Southeast Asia is China's sphere. India has no sphere. There is an Asian, and Russia is treated with kid gloves, but it's not clear that it has its own sphere, but China doesn't really take it very seriously either, but more serious than anyone else in these circumstances. And Russia's identity really, as Putin says, the order that was set up in 1945 with the Soviet Union, a superpower, is the order that should exist today. We reinforce it. And so if you look at Russian writings on Japan, Japan is violating that order. It has no right to be a normal country. It was subdued and it was the loser, and it must still be the looters, apart with the arguments that go off in Europe. And so there's much more going on with Russia and North Korea now that would be worth exploring for this, and I'm trying to do that. So that is what I see as the world order theme. Everything is really deeply immersed in history. And the 2010s, 2000s, there was something going on that was a little exceptional because there was a rise of triangularity. Russia thought it had real leverage. Japan thought it had leverage. South Korea thought it had leverage. And all those countries tried to create a triangular approach to East Asia, and that faded. We're now back to the area of bipolarity plus the global South. And China and Russia want to be, to press the global South to join them in their agenda. And so that's my overview.
Okay, and just one more, sorry, guys.
Well, I think they haven't really clarified. They talk about alternative world order, and that includes using the yuan as currency. I noticed Russia tried to sell its oil to India, and they wanted them to pay in yuan. And India was very angry about that because I don't think they had enough yuan, or they didn't want to pay in yuan anyway. I don't get the details of it very much as to what it looks like. It mainly is just being opportunistic, taking advantage of various crises. For China, it begins with the 2008 financial crisis. And Chinese told me that the hosting the Olympics was the coming out party, and everything was going to change after that. But I thought maybe this was a strategy that had been there for a really long time, and this was the time to unveil it.
Okay.
Really.
Well, is there any scenario where Xi Jinping cashiers his good friend Vladimir and sells him out? Because it seems to me that Xi had kind of a good thing going before the war in Ukraine, in the sense that he was trying to split the Europeans from the Americans, trying to break apart the West and capitalize on the fact that, the Germans want to sell lots of Volkswagens and other things to their market, et cetera. And so to kind of weaken the challenger or the enemy, or do you think that this is pretty much solved? There really is no scenario, or maybe she just simply can't. I mean, people have said for many decades the same thing about North Korea. Why does China stick by North Korea, even though it seems to be causing problems for China with its belligerent behavior? So do you see China sort of being chained to Russia pretty much under any plausible scenario, or do you think that there are possibilities for this partnership to disintegrate?
I think Russia's on a short leash, and if they press themes that China doesn't like, China will push back very hard. China knows how to use economic interdependence. They dominate. They don't. There was an example. Vladivostok celebrated an anniversary of its founding some years ago, and they had a celebration and so on, and then the Chinese found that offensive, how Russians treated it, and in an official way, they started attacking this celebration. And suddenly the Russians understood that they don't have room to talk about history the way they want to. They're not allowed into Chinese history museums. They know that, they write about it. They say, we don't trust the way Chinese are thinking about us. So Russia is in a situation where there's this growing anxiety, and China's in a situation where it presses its own leverage and doesn't know what restraint is. This is not an easy partnership to move forward. The question really is, what alternative does Russia have, given what they're doing in the West? They just have to accept what China's doing. And China has used some restraint. Whatever they do on the ground, they try to talk as if they're treating Russia respectfully. They're deferring in some ways, even when there's no deference anymore.
Gaye, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I don't think she could ever sell out Putin because he staked his own reputation on this personalistic relationship to Putin. There are a lot of Chinese that have criticized Xi for creating a relationship based on personalities. But I mean, he wouldn't sell Putin out openly, but he would do it in sort of a Chinese way. And, it'd be very subtle and just be little signs here and there.
It's a dish served cold. Huh?
Yeah.
Good.
But it wouldn't be an open break. But Russians are capable of that, but I don't think Chinese would do that. No.
Great. Well, why don't we open it up, because we have so many distinguished guests here. We can also take questions online. I think I'll be handed a cell phone or index cards or something along those lines. Yeah. Thank you, Christine. But why don't we start with folks here in the audience?
Okay, we have some questions in the audience.
When was Vladivostok?
Give them.
Sorry. When was Vladivostok founded?
Vladivostok was founded in what, 1860?
1860.
And so before that, it was perhaps part of
Wei Xiang Wei.
the
Chinese have a
Chinese.
name for it.
Yeah,
Yes,
they still use it too.
I have no doubt. 1868.
At the general population level, is there any cultural support in the western part of Russia for a closer political, or the eastern part of Russia, I'm sorry, for a closer political integration with China?
A political integration with China? No, I don't think so. Both sides recognize that the cultural aspect of the relationship is really lacking. That the leaders have a good relationship, there's strategic reasons to cooperate. They hope for better economic relations, and certainly in oil and gas, they're doing it. But on the societal level, there's always been these problems. So they create the year of China and Russia, and the year of Russia and China, the year of Chinese language in Russia, the year of Russian language in China, and it goes on and on and on, trying to get the two societies to, have a better relationship. But I would think, the shuttle traders, to the extent they had a working relationship with the other side, also contributed to that. And I saw many successful working relationships between people on both sides of the border. So it's not endless hostility, but I don't think they would support a political integration. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience?
Yes. Any more from here for now? Okay, so online, one question is, if Putin had won in Ukraine in the first few weeks and conquered the country, would Russia's embrace of China be as passionate as it is today?
I think Russia would have been passionate and also claimed a level of equality that would have made it the relationship a little bit uncomfortable in a new way. But he would have said, okay, China, we've now proven ourselves. We are one of the big three. The world resumes the grand strategic triangle of the 1980s. We are there. We've proven ourselves. We're showing how hostile we are to the West. China would have said, well, you've weakened the United States. That's a good thing. We accept you as a partner. There would still be the tensions over regional reorganization, over their different themes in Asia. The tensions about Central Asia might have risen more more obviously, because Russia would have now felt more emboldened in Central Asia, and China may have been ready to push its own agenda in Central Asia. There could have been new tensions that would have emerged, but by and large, I don't think it would have damaged the Sino-Russian relationship.
I think the Chinese were very divided about Putin's pressure on Ukraine even before it invaded Ukraine. We can think of some Chinese who are very pro-Russia, former military attachés who write a lot in China and support a military alliance between China and Russia. And then there's others who focus more on economic relations for China. And they're very critical of this relationship with Russia. And so I think the Chinese are very deeply divided on that question and debating it as much as they could.
And what's the perception now? I mean, does Russia's weakness and its need to curry favor with Beijing and the disaster that Russia is facing in Ukraine, does that make China more or less likely to press its own ambitious territorial claims to become, whether it's a move on Taiwan or to get tougher with India or to start bossing around countries around the South China Sea more? In other words, some people think that China has been sort of chastened by Putin's setbacks and it's almost a cautionary tale. But in parts of your book, it almost sounds like this is in some ways a strategic boon for China, because you've added this country that for generations you've had to worry about as a potential rival, and now they're almost a supplicant coming to you, and they've kind of softened up the existing international order. They're draining American and Western attention, weapons, et cetera, and that may open up opportunities for whether it's a smash and grab operation by the Chinese or something a little bit more subtle. So how do you think Beijing interprets its opportunities now that Russia seems to have gotten really bogged down in its own ambitious expansion?
There are quite a few Chinese articles that refer to the weakening of Russia. And Russia can't do certain things that it did before. So when they write about Central Asia, when they write about plans elsewhere in Asia, they basically are saying Russia's more limited, China can do more. So in that sense, it's emboldening China in their own sphere, which they care about most. Meanwhile, it is at the level of what they would do with Taiwan. I think that depends more on the reaction to how the US has responded. And here we've got the US strengthening alliances. This has been a remarkable period of building up US, Euro, Asian linkages. The success of the United States, whether it's on economic security issues or on rallying against Ukraine, that has given China a sense they're weaker in dealing with the US, and that limits what they can do on some issues. I haven't seen them specifically refer, what does that mean for Taiwan? But I've basically seen, and this is a separate article I've written that'll be coming out shortly, on what the US-Chinese competition has done, how it's evolved over the last couple of years, and what Chinese sources are saying about it, and its impact on what China can do in Asia.
So on that point, say that I think there's sort of things pulling in two directions that have come out on the Taiwan issue from the Ukraine lessons. One is, I think Chinese analysts were surprised at how well the West or the North hung together, and how much even countries far removed from the European conflict in East Asia did pretty well on the sanctions. I mean, there was a belief the US couldn't pull that off or wouldn't pull that off. Of course, the Trump era reinforced that view. At the same time, I think, whether in genuine thinking or in the space of discourse that goes on in China, and Gil's much deeper in this than I am, but the sense that it cemented the orthodox dominance of the view that the US is out to get China. I mean, that was already there, but it sort of reinforced the Putin line that NATO is encircling Russia, and so the devil made me do it, right? I had to go after Ukraine because NATO was on my doorstep. You hear a lot more from Chinese sources that that's what's going on toward China. So although it was already there, it kind of reinforced this notion that the US is doing the sort of alliance along the Chinese maritime periphery from Japan all the way down to India and so on.
I think you've seen that in the economic sphere with China looking to sanctions proof its economy in part in reaction to watching Russia get taken down by Western sanctions. But I have another follow-up question on this. I mean, if you all were to present this book in front of the National Security Council and President Biden and Jacques, you're along for this trip too. What would you want the takeaway to be? So you've analyzed the evolution of this partnership. You've kind of poo-pooed, I think rightly, the idea of a reverse Kissinger of trying to split Russia off from China. But what should Western policy be? What should the main takeaway for the United States be?
Okay, you've asked the what's the $64,000 question now.
That'd be more than that.
Add a few more zeros. Yeah.
And we don't have the old answers being fed to people before they were asked the question, right? That was the standard in the old days. So I would say that the first message that should have been delivered years ago, and some people didn't get that message, is you're not going to break Russia away from China. You're not, if you go to Russia and you say, we want to make you an offer if you'll break up hedge from China, which is what Abe did, which was some people did. Council on Foreign Relations had a big article on that just before the war. You're going to only say to Russia, look how we're winning by getting closer to China. Let's get even closer to China and we'll win more. So that's not the lesson, I would say. But being aware of the Sino-Russian differences and waiting for the opportunity that might evolve after the Ukraine issue settles down, and then seeing what the next stage is, understanding that you can put pressure on China and that Russia will be uncomfortable with China, and there are possibilities down the line, but no magic solution to this terrible coalition, which is now involving North Korea and Iran in a much more serious way.
I never thought that this idea, this strategy of breaking China and Russia apart made any sense at all, actually. It just told Putin, look, they're taking you seriously, this. So, yeah, I never understood that, actually. But talking about Russia, I would say that, Russia has had a presence in Asia for a really long time. Right now, it seems very China focused, but I know that they had a fort in California, Fort Ross, in the 19th century, and had lots of forts on the West Coast. And the University of Hawaii had a course on Russia and Asia starting in the 1930s, and continuously has had it. And today they have a course on Russia and Asia. And at different times, I think the United States, during the Cold War, the US has tried to block that. When the Comintern was active in Russia, I think we tried to block that also. I don't know how we did it with the Comintern. But possibly we shouldn't try to block that. We should expand, diversify Russia's presence in Asia away from total dependence on China. I think the Russians feel themselves dependent on China and very disappointed that China has let them down. You probably remember the spokesperson for the foreign ministry who was publicly stating how angry the Russians were. Well, she said it indirectly, but it was clear what she was saying, how angry that China was not coming to Russia's assistance in the Ukraine war. And when it comes from the foreign ministry spokesperson, that's a pretty serious statement. And then Putin going to North Korea for military supplies rather than China made the Chinese furious, absolutely furious, because they're bypassing China. So there's a lot of signs of discontent, but possibly having, instead of putting up roadblocks to Russia's relationship in the Asia Pacific, allow it to establish independent relations in the Asia Pacific. I don't think it'd be a good idea if China and Russia jointly establish themselves like in Southeast Asia. That might not be a good idea at all.
So letting them step on each other's toes a bit. Gaye, you pointed out earlier that there's a personal dimension to this partnership, that the relationship between Xi and Putin has been at least some glue to help hold the partnership together, even though there are these misgivings at the lower level. But if the United States can't count on any kind of major policy change to kind of break this apart, is there any hope for sort of divine intervention in the sense that, Putin and Xi, they just celebrated their 70th birthdays together, and
Make them younger than our next two presidents.
I mean, they're relatively young, but for Putin, for the average Russian male, 70 is actually not that young. He's been sitting at very long tables, and so I'm just wondering, when Putin and Xi leave the scene, however that happens, does that change your assessments of this partnership? Or some people say the Chinese and the Russian systems select for these kind of leaders, and so you're not going to get like a Chinese Gorbachev, coming to power anytime soon. You're more likely to get a Chinese Putin, or in Russia, another Putin to replace Putin. And so the fundamental drivers and especially the anti-Western antipathy that you have that's really undergirding this partnership is likely to continue regardless of the personalities at the top.
Well, I think there's this fundamental identity theme inherited from the past that these leaders have played on, built up. So it's not just the old identity, it's the way it's been reinforced in a big way. And that'll make it very tough to drive a wedge or to change either of them. I think the efforts in the mid-2010s were probably the most serious that could exist to try to find a way to reach Putin or Xi, whether it was Obama's reset and then efforts with Xi Jinping, or whether it was the Japanese and South Korean approaches to Putin. They really wanted to make sure that Putin didn't throw in all his lot with Xi Jinping. I think that makes me doubt what Gaye was suggesting, that there's some alternative Asian framework that could work. So I think it really has to happen as a result of trauma in Russia and Putin leaving, and then a sense of Russia, where are we going from here? And that's the only opportunity. Once that happened, something could change, or a real shift in China because of the economic problems. If they do get increasingly serious and China decides that it really wants to deal with economics before anything else, it may put Russia on the margins and move in a different direction. So those are, I think, the structural factors are the most hope, not simply focusing on leaders.
I don't want to speak to the Chinese side of it, but I think Xi is distinctive. We can debate sort of when people figured out he was going to be a departure from what it seemed to be the trend of weaker Chinese top leaders from Mao Zedong to Jiang Zehu. Clearly, that's been a reversal. But I would agree with Gil that there are a lot of structural factors that they're pushing China toward perhaps having to re-engage, or at least to sort of not go too far down a very costly path of confrontation and separation. But some of that is U.S. policy choice. I mean, we have to calibrate what we want to do in the way of things that are pushing China in that direction. But I think the Chinese have led us into uncharted territory, because whatever you think of Xi as an individual leader, he has wrought some real institutional damage. I mean, one doesn't want to romanticize how institutionalized or stable succession policies and politics were in China, but they're certainly taken a couple of steps back with the elimination of term limits, with the non-creation of an heir apparent, with the sort of leveling down of everybody who's not Xi, whether it be purging potentially powerful opponents or not even allowing allies to take on much of a role. It means that when Xi does go to meet Mao, we may be in a very precarious or at least unpredictable situation.
We've got a situation now where the United States is pushing back very hard on China economics. And the question is China going to say the US is de-risking and not decoupling, and we can work with it? Or is China going to say, as it's been saying lately, the US is demonizing China and containing China, and there's no way to work with the United States? That's the question that's driving the world right now.
All right, well, on that happy note, Raleigh, do you want to take us home here?
Well, thank you, Gaye and Gilbert, for very interesting discussion and comments. And I want to let our audience in person know that your book will be on sale just a few steps away after this event. And thank you, Jacques and Mike, for your moderation of this event. Really appreciate it. And thank you to our audience for coming.